Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the 15th episode in our webinar series, Turbulent Times, which is a series that we started during the lockdown to look at some of the big issues related with COVID, but also some related topics. You may have been tuning in expecting to see Karen Farrell hosting this. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it, but I am diving in her place. I'm Chris Moriarty. I'm Director of Insight and Engagement at IWFM, and I'm joined by an expert panel who I'll introduce shortly to talk about today's topic, which is diversity and inclusion. So far in the series, as I said, we've explored lots of different aspects of the impact of the global pandemic and how it's been affecting the workplace and facilities management profession. But today we want to talk about diversity and inclusion. And I think what we can say is that whilst the pandemic has obviously dominated headlines, there's been other headlines during this time, particularly the Black Lives Matters movement, which has started a big conversation around one key area of diversity and inclusion. And actually, maybe this is a good time to talk about many of the other aspects of that as we get involved in this idea of building back better. And that's certainly a sentiment that's been growing in that people don't want to go back after this pandemic back to how we were. Actually, this is a real opportunity for reflection and change. So in that context, it's we want to look at it from our profession and our industry's viewpoint. And I think probably in the past, what we've tended to do is think about some of the building material aspects of the debate, particularly accessibility, which IWFM, when it was BIFM, had a lot of work done, sort of 5 6 years ago. But obviously, there's more to it than that now, and that's something that we'll explore today. So we are a profession, I'm sure you'll agree, that focuses on people, and because we identify as shapers and enablers of workplace, and ensuring that people can do the best job. But we also have agency and ownership in this area, and we can't just rely on other functions and professions to take responsibility for this important topic. And what we kind of want to do today is have a wide-ranging conversation about the challenges, some of the opportunities, some of the backgrounds, but also for it to be action-led. This webinar, in a sense, was led by one of the conversations we had in a previous webinar around skills that kind of looked at diversity in the profession. So we want this to be action-led, and we want some real tangible things to come out of it from the Institute in support of the profession. So first, just before we go into some of the debates, just a few points of reflection. So how do we drive a wider DNI agenda? Well, actually, for that conversation to start, we probably need to look at where we are today. If you look at IWFM's membership data, so we look at all those active members we have right now, we have a gender split, which is 72% male and 28% female. And this comes through similar statistics, similar ratios in our recent Insight and Engagement survey, which is a wide-ranging membership survey that asks about how we can support members better. But we obviously picked up some of these demographic data points as well. And that came back about 73, 26%. So you can see that there's a bit of consistency there. Now, what we also do in the survey, but we don't do fully in terms of the membership data, is we also look at ethnicity. And what we saw here is we are predominantly a white profession as well. 82% of respondents to that survey states that they were from a white background. Now, these are just two aspects of this wide-ranging diversity inclusion debate, but it does start to give us a few indications of how we are doing as a profession and an industry when it comes to diversity and inclusion. We do have low barriers to entry when it comes to the service lines that we offer. So there is a lot of diversity in there, but maybe there's the conversations we have about the inclusion side of things and how people can progress through our industry. And also as well, I think there's a context that the FM profession isn't necessarily one that people choose to get into as well. So there's lots of different aspects of this that we need to be mindful of. But rather than me talking about this and giving you some of the views from the Institute and the work that we are doing, and of course I'll bring splatterings of that in, like I said earlier on, we are joined by 3 experts. And what we'll be doing today is covering 3 or 4 really core questions that we want them to explore. And then we'll have a little bit of time later on for the Q&A from you guys on the webinar. We want to hear about your experiences, some of your stories, some of your challenges and questions, and we'll as a panel, we'll look at those. So I'll just briefly name check the individuals, but they will then give you a little bit of a backstory to their route into this debate, the angles that they're coming at, and what today they hope to be able to bring to the conversation. So we're joined by Laura Guri, who's head of legal places and communities at NG, Jean Hewitt, who's a senior inclusive design consultant from Bureau Household Engineering, and Colin Kimber, who's the associate director of Pareto FM. So if I can ask Laura first, if you can talk us through your background, tell us where you're coming to from this debate, some of the work that you're doing with NG, and then we'll pass to Colin and then on to Jim.
Great, thanks very much, Chris. Yeah, I head up the legal team that supports the division of places and communities at NG. I previously headed up a legal team that supported the FM business. So my background is majority is energy, FM, and construction, but I was born and raised in Australia. My family is Middle Eastern background. So I grew up in Australia in the Middle Eastern family was quite interesting. And as I started to study law and work in law, I found that the majority of the people in that industry were white males, particularly at the senior levels, at partner level, etc. And Australia, I'm sure many of you have visited or been there. Certain parts of it are very kind of not as diverse, if you like, as somewhere like London. So when I came to London, I was really, really surprised by the extent of diversity here, just walking around the streets, etc. But when I went into a law firm here, I found it was the same theme of being white, male, middle-aged, kind of senior levels, and any females that I saw were either, single, unmarried, no children, or were running around trying to juggle having a family. So I thought perhaps change industries and go into an environment where there may be more opportunities for me as a female. Ethnicity really wasn't a point, but I could see clearly that I don't think there was any partners at the law firm I was at that were black or even, Asian or any kind of ethnic minorities. There may have been one or two, but in a large law firm, a city firm, it was at the time, probably 10, 15 years ago now, it was definitely rare to see. So I went to another energy company. I think there, again, most of the senior management were males, white, and I think you start to understand it's the industry, isn't it? Energy, construction, FM, I think historically has always been male dominant, particularly in senior roles. And I think if you look at FM, I don't like to use the term, but lower level roles such as cleaners, etc., that tend to be more females and more mixed backgrounds. So when I came to what was Coakley at the time, now NG, on the FM side, I saw a bit more diversity, with the project managers in construction. But again, more males than females. That's gradually changed in the last few years. So I've been there for 5.5, almost 6 years. We've had a global CEO who was Isabel Cachet, who's recently left, but we now have a UK CEO who's Nicola Lover. I'm sure some of you may know of her. She's presented at one of the conferences in the past. So that kind of is quite positive in that we have great role models, on a very senior level, but that's kind of a handful of people of that level, and then in between, the majority still white males. And I think about a year ago, I was just coming off maternity leave the last time, maybe 2 years ago now, and I was asked if I wanted to get involved in starting a kind of a women's focused area. So we started Women in NG. It's been running for a year and a half now. We're just building it up, and basically the aim is just to support women and look at what do we need to do. And for me, my view is long term is not short term. So we can all talk about equal pay and things like that, but I do think it is about developing and supporting the longevity of it and being realistic. So we have a lot of grads coming in on the grad scheme that are female, who are engineers, etc. So in 5-10 years' time, hopefully they'll end up in senior management. But again, it's rare to see, if you talk about ethnicity, you see many people of different ethnic backgrounds coming through, and you even walk around the offices and it's still the same. So as the chair of women in NG also have a seat on the DNI panel, or I sit in on their meetings, and ethnicity has now been a big focus for us. And we are starting to look at ways of which we can attract people of different backgrounds to more senior or middle management senior roles. And it's not easy, because it hasn't been something traditionally done in the past, and I think these kind of things take time. And I personally am very against quotas and ticking the box. So it's about at least giving people the opportunity, but I think the view is it should always be merit driven, and that's a bit of a challenge, because I think people have different views on that. So I'm not sure if that's enough in terms of background, if you wanted any more. Or
I think that's very comprehensive. Thank you very much. So we'll come back. There's a few bits in there that I want to come back to in our first question. I can't remember who I said will go first. So go next. Sorry. So I'm just gonna shoot from the hip. Colin, do you want to just give us a little bit of background about the work that you've been doing, the angles that you're coming into this debate?
So hi everyone, I'm Colin Kimber. I'm Associate Director with Pareto Facilities Management. I've been in the FM industry for 15 years, and before that, if you read the bio, I was a professional dancer. And I tend to mention that in this context these days, because even when I was in a profession that is traditionally accepted as having a lot of gay men in it, I still felt the need to hide myself at times in that industry. Now, when I got into the FM industry, I was very lucky to work in a bubble, one single site on a contract where there were a lot of LGBT plus people. So I had a really nice start into the industry, but as I spread my wings, I experienced the incredibly straight male dominated environment that we do find ourselves in sometimes. And so a lot of my experience has been going from team to team, always having to go through that coming out experience where I have to look for the right moment where it's okay to test the water and see whether I can be myself. Fast forwarding on to joining Pareto FM, which is quite liberating, a company that wears its social value credentials on its sleeve the whole time. I am almost actively enforced to be as open as I possibly can be, and that's been a very positive experience for me. So much so that I now drive the D&I agenda within the organisation alongside the MD, and I've become part of the steering committee for LGBT plus in FM, which is an independent network in the facilities management industry, where we all take our badges off at the door and we don't worry about competitiveness, but we work together to try and make the FM industry as supportive and as attractive as possible to people in the LGBT plus community. We run events so that people can network. We bring in speakers so that we can open up people's personal experiences, because we firmly believe that by engaging with people and learning about people's individual stories, that's the way to break down ignorance in our society. Because a very good friend of mine once said there is a big difference between homophobia and ignorance. A lot of the time it's just because people don't understand. So it's about getting those personal stories out there. And alongside that, we are building a library of standard documentation that we are happy to share with organisations that want to start their D&I journey from an LGBT plus perspective, and support them if they're partway through that journey and need some advice.
That's great, thank you very much. And Jean, do you want to finish off in the introductions and just give us a bit of background from your professional viewpoint, and also how you're coming into the D&I debate?
Sure, of course. Hello everyone. It's a real pleasure, firstly, to be invited to take part in this discussion, because inclusion has played such an important role in my life, both personally and at work, for the last 20 years. So I've transitioned across from an FM background. Actually, I was originally a chartered FM in the days when we all talked about the DDA back in 2000, Disability Discrimination Act, and then moved on to become an accredited access professional. So 100% of my work is about usually looking at the built environment, but how people use it and how they engage with it. So I might start off as part of the design team, working with architects and so forth. But of course, once that building is occupied, that's when the real test comes, how good it actually is for the people that are then using it. So all those management regimes come to the fore, and that's where the FM fits in there. So for me, an inclusive environment has to be one that is designed and managed in a way that meets the widest spectrum of needs, and also by people who understand intersectionality, how those needs intersect. As Colin has said, we're not one-dimensional. I'm not just a woman. I also have a sexuality. I also have a role as a parent and as a worker. I might have some disabilities. I might have some faith needs, and so on and so forth. For those that haven't come across me before, I'm the author of the Institute's Good Practice Guide on Access and Inclusion, and that's freely available to members on the website if you haven't seen it before. I also, for my sins, have represented IWFM on the BSI committee for many years, in particular on a committee for accessible and inclusive environments, which basically means I'm contributing on behalf of the FM industry, so you guys, on standards such as the BS 8300, which is the industry bible on how you design a building and how you manage it in a way that helps everybody. I'm also a part-time lecturer at UCL, running an inclusive places module, and that gives me a wonderful opportunity to see lots of young people coming forward who are much more switched on to this inclusion and intersectionality than ever before. So I'm really excited about the future and what the human-centric spaces might mean. So that's me. Thank you.
Great. Well, so like I said at the start of this, we've got some core themes that we will go to. I'm just looking at the first one, which is kind of starting to explore what diversity and inclusion means within an FM context. But I think from some of the introductions we have, we started to creep into it. But Jean, maybe we'll immediately come back to you just to explore it. So you mentioned that you've been working, you kind of sit in two camps in your experience from FM and now your work today in terms of those designing the inclusive environments. So how do you see the FM teams and individuals, the professionals coming through? How do you see them approaching the D&I debate, or are they coming at it very specifically, or is it linked to some bigger stuff? What's their kind of starting point and their motivation and their kind of drive behind some of the work that you get involved with? Because that might give us a bit of an indication of how FM collectively is looking at D&I at the moment.
Well, for a lot of FMs, they don't have a seat at the top table at concept design, unfortunately. And if they did, I think we would have much better buildings than we currently receive at the end of the day and have to occupy and run correctly. So for me, the FM is a key role because they are the people. It was always said many, many years ago, the FM is left holding the DDA baby. So if the building is designed right for people, it's the FM that then has to pick up all those pieces and try and manage it in a better way and do workarounds and so forth. Traditionally, a lot of people think about the wheelchair access and lots of people are still using that DDA handle. But for me, we're moving on, and I think there's lots of excitement and lots of evidence that FMs really want to do the mental health and wellbeing stuff. They really are starting to think about faith rooms. They're thinking about cultural needs. They're thinking about mums and nursing mums rooms, things like that. And in the last year, I've had several conversations, even around menopause. How can we design better for people going through menopause? And that's triggered other thoughts about men too, who also experience temperature problems and stuff like that. So really exciting debate going on. So I think, what do I want to say on this? It's so much more than how the building's designed. It's how it functions, how it's managed. So if the FMs can grasp that and can grasp intersectionality and how we're all unique, we will end up, some of the initiatives that Colin's been talking about a really, really important part and role in that. And it's just about widening our view. So I know at work we've got we have a fair committee and we talk about intersectionality and all the different aspects. We'll take each strand on its own, but then quite often we mix them. And that's really what society is. We are a mixture. And I think if we can get some diversity into the FM teams, much more than there is now, that can only help. Because if you're only if you're only from one strand, you can probably only think in one way. Whereas when you have diversity across design and FM, then obviously you're then going to quite naturally cater for a much wider audience and meet those needs instinctively without having to be prompted to do so.
That's great. And Jean, you touched on. So I want to bring this over to you now, Colin. in terms of bringing more people from diverse backgrounds, from that are bringing different experiences to the table. You touched on some of the challenges that you had early doors, which is coming into something and you didn't feel comfortable enough to bring your whole self to be very open about just who you are, which I think won't be an uncommon experience, unfortunately, in any walk of life. But I do know from some of the work that I've done with the LGBT plus and FM group, there was this sort of sense of making sure that the industry is seen as being a welcoming environment for people who do just want to come and do some great work, regardless of who they are and what they do and where they come from. So do you see those attitudes starting to change, and do you think that we are approaching this in the right way as a community, as an FM community, in terms of encouraging more conversations about diversity and inclusion and encouraging a more open debate, which could lead to that diversity that Jean's been talking about?
I think we're getting there. I think there are definitely some spots of brilliance in our industry, but I think there's still a long way to go. I think that yes, the working environment is very important. That's one side of things, but actually, workplace experience is becoming more and more important. And I think that's kind of a bit of a new frontier for us in the FM industry, because I find myself getting more and more involved with organisations that I work with in talking about how their employees experience things and what sort of psychological effect is that having on them. And certainly by me being as involved and as visible as I am, it's certainly got that on the table. I've been able to have some really positive discussions with my customers. We've been able to link up our network and our organisation with their networks and support each other, and actually really open up that conversation. And I think we need to not miss a trick here, because you mentioned earlier about people not necessarily choosing to come into FM as young people. It's not necessarily on their list, but young people these days, yes, there are still professions out there that are very cut and dried, like doctor, lawyer, that sort of thing. But for people that aren't that clear cut about their decisions, there's a lot of things on the table. And what they tend to look at is, what does the organisation that I'm going to go and work for stand for? What do they believe in? Do they believe in the same things that I do? Do they support people that go through what I go through as an individual? And people are going to find themselves attracted to that kind of industry. And certainly, we all know that you can work in a myriad of different environments in the FM industry. So it's not just a case of working in an office. There are so many different spaces. So I think the variety we can offer, the variety of tasks, the opportunities for development, and the variety of environments we can work in, if we can create a space that is entirely supportive, not just for LGBT plus people, but for all people from all diverse backgrounds, I think that we're onto a really special thing there, because bringing everybody's diverse opinion into the mix does create creative thought. It does make sure that we're thinking from things from every perspective. Because I only have my background and my experience to base things on. So I think the one thing I've learned through all of my experience in this D&I stuff is to kind of make sure that I remain humble about this, because I don't know what you're going through and I don't know what you've been through. And actually, I want to know about that. I want to know about that from everybody, so that we can kind of come together, find common ground, and make sure we're accommodating everybody's individual needs.
And you mentioned earlier on about Pareto, and I know from seeing the work that the team does and the communications that come through, you get that vibe about that organisation, that they really care about this stuff, and because it's right to, and I don't think, sometimes in organisations you do get a sort of a sense of virtue signalling, but I don't see that with Pareto. But what was interesting there is that you started talking about some of the business benefits of that, and actually it's equipped the organisation to be a better place to support organisations. So do you see that really driving performance, compared to I'm not asking you to name and shame some of the other organisations work there, but are you starting to see actually that this is it gathers momentum because it's the right thing to do, but equally it drives the right way of doing business, and the thing just sort of feeds itself as well?
It does, yes. I mean, I've noticed over the last 18 months or so that we've found ourselves being sought out in the industry by particular organisations that like what we've got to say in this arena, and it's certainly reflecting itself in the. So, like, we have like a 93% attrition rate in our staff. So we are, you know, we're bringing people in that want to be part of what we're trying to achieve, and they want to stay there. I mean, we're on a very interesting journey because we're a relatively young company, so we've gone very quickly from a group of like-minded individuals that are able to keep this going amongst ourselves to actually realizing that we need to challenge ourselves, and we need to start setting out a bit of a strategy around what we want to achieve. I mean, certainly the Black Lives Matter stuff that's happened more recently has made us sit up and actually take a fresh look at ourselves, because it's very easy to do some good things and then sit back on your laurels and think that, oh, you know, we're doing some good stuff, we're a good company, we're a good bunch of people. But that actually made us stop, pause, and actually look at what we've done. And we realized that, you know, although we have a diverse approach where BAME people are concerned from a recruitment perspective, that's kind of where it seemed to end. We do some work with young people, but we started challenging ourselves about how much further could we go. So yeah, we're just at the beginning of starting that conversation with the wider organisation. We're not going to sit in the boardroom and decide what's best for everyone. We're going to give everybody the tools so that we can have that conversation and build a strategy together.
Yeah, and then Laura, actually using that kind of segue of the boardroom, I know that I'm right to say you're at board level at NG, and you've been involved in some of the different programs that's going on. You've already mentioned the Women in NG program, and you've fed into some other Dni. There was something I found quite interesting from your introduction. You've already touched on some of your viewpoints in terms of diversity and inclusion in FM. But there was something interesting about what you said, and I kind of hinted at it in my introduction, is that do you see a disparity in, if we look at diversity first? I think the inclusion part of it is probably another element to it, but in terms of just diversity first, you mentioned that in the sort of service level roles, you know, the contractors are out in organisations, cleaning staff, security staff, so on. There is quite a lot of diversity, however you want to look at it, with gender, ethnicity, and economic diversity as well, and all that sort of stuff. But is it fair to say, and if we use our membership as a bit of a proxy for the layer of management that sits above those contractors, that diversity doesn't bleed through, it doesn't come through into what I've kind of written here is and I'm sort of cautiously dancing around these sort of professional roles which might need qualifications and training, that might need career development and all the rest of it. Do you think that that's an area that we could do more, and our NG themselves kind of looking at how they pull some that diversity through into the organisation more widely?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, Colin, you mentioned variety, and I think you're right that FM is an industry that is filled with variety. So it allows people of different backgrounds, whether it's, you know, race, sexual orientation, whatever it is, to come into the industry, because there's a role for everyone, if you like. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that it kind of stops at a certain level, and I think you're right in saying that it needs to go up, and I think it needs to go up in order to influence the policies that are being put into place, the decisions that are being made. And for that to happen, I think it's about looking at promotions, looking at how you recruit. And we've been doing that in Women in NG, but I think now we're looking at it from an NG perspective wider, to say, okay, how are we recruiting people? Are we actually specifically targeting people or attracting people through our recruitment process, through our job descriptions, job specifications? Are we making it clear that we are open to and we are diverse in terms of ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc.? We're looking at that, and I think until you get people in the more senior roles, and we have had some quite senior recruits recently, so women of different ethnic backgrounds being, you know, in quite high or quite senior levels. But I think it has to continue, and the variety piece is important because it attracts, but you need to push those people through. And I'm sure we'll come on to talk about it, but what is stopping that? I think there's a variety of factors, including the people who are actually promoting and the people that are actually interviewing. They need to be of the right mindset. So it's really touching and kind of reaching out to those people and ensuring that they understand what the challenges are and how to overcome them. And I think that's what our Dni panel is focusing on. How do we recruit? And there's a massive piece happening on, on that at the moment, but also how do we educate, and not to say that in a patronizing way, but how do we educate senior management who've worked in the industry for 20, 30 years? Some of these guys have been in the army, so they have a very, very stern frame of mind. And how do we change that and challenge that in a positive way without making people feel that actually we're criticizing them or we're accusing them of something? Because it can be quite sensitive for people who, I think, Colin, you mentioned about the ignorance versus kind of people being, say, homophobic or racist or whatever it is. I think you need to understand there is some ignorance in people understanding, particularly on the ethnicity side, when they're recruiting, the cultural differences and how they may come across, and therefore they're not exactly going to be the same as interviewing, say, a white male, and understand the nuances. So I think that's something that we're looking at. Definitely it's something that needs to continue.
It's interesting that you mentioned education, and I think actually, there's also a role for open ignorance. I would sit here and say a lot of the characteristics that we are talking about, I have no experience of them whatsoever, and I find myself, I can sometimes feel nervous because I don't feel informed enough, or I've got the right tools or the right training that allows me to understand the bits I know. It's almost like a classic strategic framework. Know what you know what you don't know, and sometimes that know what you don't know is as important as knowing stuff. I kind of want to bounce this over to you, Jean, now, because some of the bits we're talking about there in terms of education, I think are really important. But equally, there is this need to sort of explain why Dni is important, and there's a real dilemma as well, I think, in that some people are of the viewpoint we shouldn't have to explain why it's good for business because we should just be doing it. It's at a human level we should be doing it. But there are business benefits from it, and one of the areas, I know that we've had this conversation before in the previous webinar, but and other conversations. One of the areas of design that I'm really interested in and find really interesting from a number of angles is the neurodiversity element of it. So there's another angle there. But again, it kind of feels like there needs to be more education about why that's important. And actually, yes, we can do it at a human level, but also, this makes total sense. Come on, let's just take a different view. So how do you think we can be better at embedding some of those messages and those elements of education? Because like Laura's hinted at and you talked about in your intro, is that knowledge at the right level? You were talking about FM not being at that sort of concept design point of view. Actually, if we educated the profession and they were able to be in those conversations, then surely we'd end up with a better result.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there to unpick.
Yeah, sorry, that was a long question, wasn't it?
No, that's okay. Yeah. So I think one of the things that Laura mentioned was about people being seen. So and that helps. That in a way that educates. So I think the opportunity to go into schools, and particularly you might cherry pick which areas you go into schools so that you are being seen, and an FM is seen as a profession that is open to everyone is a really good way to start. But I think also that we don't routinely educate. So some organisations have got a routine awareness session that they have as part of their induction. But it doesn't really cover everything, and particularly for older people that have been in the industry for some time, which Laura sort of alluded to, they won't have grown up in a school that had everybody in mainstream. They might have grown up in, for example, all white, all straight, maybe a boys' school, girls' school, whatever. They won't have experienced different faiths and cultures and skin colours and beliefs, and all of that rich mix that the children are getting now. So the younger people, I hope, as they come through, are much more open to this, are much less likely to discriminate because they're growing up and that's part of their education. But there is this gap in the middle of people that haven't had that. And I think that's something, maybe it's something IWFM could look at, is to whether you can have online content to help people, so there would be sections on faith, sexuality, sexual orientation, and all of these other elements, because it's such a rich mix and there's such a lot to learn. I started in the access industry 20 years ago, and every day I learned something new, quite a lot new every day about people. So you touched on neurodiversity there. That's quite a new area. So we've sort of known that some people think differently to the mass. We now know that around 20% or more of the population is not neurotypical, but neurodiverse in some way. So they might be neurodivergent, have ADHD, autism, something like that. They might be neurodegenerative, so it's been caused by a brain injury, or they've got dementia and so on. These are really important factors. If you're running buildings and you don't understand this, and you don't understand what might give someone sensory overload, for example, it's really difficult. You can't just intuitively know that certain colours or certain patterns might cause distress. And if you know that and you've got it in your building, you also know how to deal with it. So I think we need quite a rich mix of how to educate people about it. Some of it could be through industry, like IWFM could do something for its members, but also different organisations approach this in a different way. And if the people at the top don't understand the intersectionality and all that means and that richness of it, how can you ever hope anyone to actually understand there is a need for this training, because it's not on their radar at all. So I think education is really, really key.
Colin, just to take that on a step, what Jean's kind of hinted at, there's an element of empathy, isn't there? And as a skill, being open to hearing other people's experiences and not necessarily claiming to have heard it and therefore I know it, but understanding that there are different experiences. I know that in work that I did at a previous institute, the Institute of Marketing, when we looked at diversity and inclusion, we were talking about the importance of it, because actually your customer base are diverse. So if you're trying to engage with them, actually having different voices and different experiences around the room can help with that. But the same could be applied to a workforce, right? And you touched earlier on about how you're able to have these conversations with your organisations or your clients to sort of say, actually, there are some other ways of thinking about this. Do you think that they themselves, are they kind of approaching it with their hands up, say, look, we're not great in this area, we need some help? Do you think that where that help could come from, how it could be shaped, what the priorities should be? Because we can talk about education being important, and Jean's touched on some examples there, but we need something practical, right, to be able to allow people to feel that comfort in taking on what is a complicated program of work.
Absolutely, and I think that the challenge in this area is that some people are looking for the answer, and the truth is there is no answer. The answer is not the same for everybody. It's different, and the only way to really answer the question is to keep the conversation going. But I think a lot of the time, because people don't want to upset anybody or tread on any toes or do the wrong thing, they don't do anything, and that's almost worse. So I think, what did you call it? Conscious ignorance or something you said earlier. I think you need to be prepared to say, I don't know the answer to this. And I think that's why I've been able to have some conversations like this with organisations I work with, because some of them are doing great things, others are doing nothing, others have made mistakes. But because we approach this from an open and inquisitive perspective, it allows people to feel safe to admit their shortcomings perhaps in this. And I think it must be very difficult for large organizations to go, actually, we don't know what we're doing here. Because I think what we need to do is change the mindset around that, because from my perspective, that is an incredibly powerful statement to make, really brave, and actually quite admirable, for someone to make that kind of statement. I mean, Jean was saying about education, and I do agree. I think that the younger generation that are coming through are going to be very, very different to the way that some of us are. But I think that in our industry, we probably need to accept that another level of education needs to begin when people come into the workplace, because a lot of people won't have had that experience. So we need to kind of start it again. And it's not enough just to have a policy that sits in an HR folder. it needs to be talked about. It needs to be there in induction. It needs to be something that's promoted within the organisation. Senior leadership need to be seen to be getting behind these initiatives, and people need to be involved, because otherwise the only time you're ever going to use the policy is if somebody does something wrong. You know, if I feel like I've been slighted in some way and I need to raise a grievance because someone's done something against me, why does it need to get there? You know, I mean, certainly in the LGBT plus community, there's a stat that always makes me shudder. 62% of grads go back in the closet when they go into the workplace, because they've been in a completely freeing environment where they've been able to be themselves and get involved in whatever the hell they want, and really find themselves. And then they come into the workplace and hide because they don't automatically feel like they can be themselves. Now, I mean, thinking about things like institutionalized racism and stuff like that, and decisions that have been made historically that are still affecting the way that BAME people are experiencing society. You know, I can hide who I am. I can adjust my behavior and come across as a straight white male and attract all the privilege that would come with that. But a BAME person can't hide who they are. They're going to experience that no matter what. And I think we need to be opening these discussions and challenging the way that we behave, challenging the way we operate, that sort of stuff.
It's heartbreaking, really. I mean, when you start putting it into terms like that, it is heartbreaking. I think that's one of the mechanisms we kind of got to show people, or be able to explain to people, here's how it feels like actually, and if we can somehow change that debate to allow everyone to, if they don't necessarily experience it, to understand it and to kind of put themselves into other person's shoes. I do like what you said as well there about the, you know, that we tend to reach for these things when there's a problem as opposed to being proactive about it. It does make me think about, you know, I'm a big football fan, and, you know, you see players that have got, you know, where there's been particularly racism, and a player's been pulled up for it and been punished, and then you sort of see tagged onto the end, and there'll be an educational program that they'll go on as almost as a punishment, like a reform, as opposed to go, well, why are we doing this in the first place? Because we recognise that we have a societal problem. Laura, just from some of the bits that you talked about there, you know, you mentioned ethnicity, so, you know, clearly that is a theme that keeps cropping up, and I like what Colin's saying as well, is that, you know, some things in this debate are visible, some aren't, and there's not necessarily, there's about as many pros and cons each side of that. You know, you shouldn't have to hide who you are, but equally sometimes you can't. But NG, you know, from what you're saying, that this conversation is happening at board level, and what role how important do you see that in terms of senior leadership driving this? And do you, I don't want to say specifically about NG, but generally speaking, do you see that openness to change from senior leadership, and how important that is? You know, are leaders willing? Because like Colin said, it can be a bit nerve-wracking. It does take courage and bravery to go, we're not good enough, we need to change, but I don't know how to. Do you see that in the work that you do and with senior leaders, either in NG, but or even, you know, the NG experiences with their clients? Because a lot of the time they'll deal with senior leaders in their client organisations as well.
Yeah, no, I can confidently say I do see. I think, I mean, our chief HR officer is, Rosanna is someone that, if anyone's going to push change, it's her, and she's not afraid to ask the challenging questions. Same goes for Nicola Lovett, our CEO. And I do think you need people who, I know it sounds quite odd, but having, say, for instance, women there who have probably experienced some challenges in their careers because of that, being able to push agendas makes a big difference. And at the end of the day, I think being able to talk about their experiences in different contexts really helps show people that we've all been affected by something. And so as it's affected them in certain ways, there's other people being affected in other ways, if that makes sense. So I do think we have the positive role models there. And like I said, they're few and far between, but they're there, and I can see them pushing the agenda, and they're not stopping. And I saw an email, you know, I'm on maternity leave, but still checking emails as you do. And I saw an email that there was kind of some output of the Dni panel discussion, and Rosanna's response and Nicola's response was, it's not enough. We need to go further. So I think it's just pushing and challenging people at that level, I think it will make a difference, and I'm confident of that. Whether or not how far it trickles down, like I said, because in middle management you do have a certain group of people who are used to a certain way of working and working with certain group of people as well. I don't know, but they will be challenged. So I don't think there's a choice at the moment. I think people are recognising it, and in the industries we are, FM being one, but also in energy and construction, it's about pushing that change and making sure people understand it has to happen.
So I'm going to stay with you, Laura, because we're moving now on to some of the questions that we're getting from attendees of the webinar today. So if you are listening and you've got a question, a comment, a story, an experience you want to share with us, do use the question function on your control panel there. But one of the ones that comes in, I think, is a really interesting area. It talks about what does this actually look like in practice? And I think what it sort of hints at, and something that is a really prickly debate, is measurement. So how does an organisation know that they're doing well, and how do they measure that? Because one of the most interesting but certainly controversial interviews I've seen was with Professor Peterson, I think, is a Canadian lecturer who garners a lot of controversy, but he did talk a bit about, in Sweden as an example, there's the equality paradox, where they have recognised as doing some of the best work globally to lower barriers to certain professions. That's where the sort of study focused on, particularly things like engineering, where they said, right, we haven't got enough females coming into engineering, we need to do more work on it. So they did amazing work, and it was considered one of the sort of lowest barriers to entry there. However, when they looked at the stats afterwards, they found that the result was more men joining engineering. And he sort of talks about the equality paradox, which is when you have choice, you tend to choose the things you want to do as opposed to going maybe on a programmed kind of a real push nudge approach to getting you into certain professions. So I forget how he characterized it. He said you have equality of opportunity, or you have equality of final result, but you can't have both. So measurement is a really controversial, difficult bit. But how, Laura, just from your experience and some of the work you do, how do we approach measurement? How do we keep track of the work we're doing? How do we make sure we're making progress? And how do we, because measurement will be important to keep us on track, right? You know, if you talked about your leader saying this isn't enough, we'll need to be able to look at something to know when we are making progress. So how do you think we approach the measurement debate?
It's interesting you say that, because we had a debate about publishing our statistics. So obviously there's certain things by law you have to publish, but in terms of, I think ethnicity was the last discussion I was part of, about whether or not we publish statistics, particularly where they're not the greatest. And I think the conclusion was, and it may have changed since I've been on maternity, but I think the conclusion was that we should publish them, and then measure, and that would be a kind of a motivator for us to push harder and harder, and then measure the difference. I think you have to go by the numbers, because that's the way, the proof's in the pudding, they're the facts. I think also you talked about, interestingly enough, the grad scheme, and I may have mentioned, we've had through our grad scheme a large number of women coming through, engineers, in areas that we traditionally haven't had women. I think we're using that as to measure where we're going in the future, because I think this is like I said before, a long-term kind of plan, and it requires dedication over a long period of time, and you can't expect to see the results, very quickly. So when you're talking about measurement, I think you need to be realistic. Set your goals, kind of 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the track, and not expect that you're going to put in place some ad hoc measures and get a response that you then publish and say, wow, we're doing great. I think be brave. You have to be brave enough to put the numbers out there, even if they're slightly dire, but that should motivate us to work hard towards that. So I think measurement is being honest and saying this is where we are and this is where we're trying to get to in a reasonable space of time, and not expect to change overnight.
That's interesting, Colin. It kind of makes me think of one of the points you made earlier on, which is, we're a combination of things, and sometimes when we get into measurement, it does kind of feel a bit tick boxy. I'm going to put myself in that box and this box and that box, and then we're going to report on the different boxes. And there's also another challenge potentially that I can see. You were talking about actually the comfort you had of being completely open about who you were in the context. So that's going to be difficult for measurement as well, right? We're going to have to give people that confidence that you can just tell us, what your makeup is, because we're quite keen to make sure that we have diverse representation and we are listening to people from different backgrounds, from different viewpoints.
Definitely. I mean, I think it's taken us over 2 decades to get used to the fact that you were asked about your ethnic origin on forms. And yet things like sexual orientation and gender identity are still not included. So, I mean, some people are starting to. I mean, what companies tend to do to try and get a steer on what's going on with LGBT plus people is they measure the rather not say box and try and understand it from that perspective. But to be honest, it's almost like everyone needs to take a deep breath and add this so that we can go through the decades-long process of getting used to the fact that I'm not gonna be put on a blacklist because I tick this box. There's fear there, Yeah. So we're not really going to get stuff, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, we have no idea what attrition rates in the FM industry are for LGBT plus people because there's no data.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think society generally, there's a lot of areas that are taboo. We're almost too scared to even ask the question. Never mind the response, because I blog about mental health and I get loads of great feedback from it because people go, I can't believe you're talking about it. It's great to hear it. And I'm like, geez, we've got to talk about this stuff. But my wife, Laura, you mentioned that you're on maternity leave at the minute. We've just had twins 6 weeks ago. And what I find really interesting is that when even my wife went in for a recent appointment, we're talking to a medical professional, talking to a doctor, and their approach to mental health is another area that we haven't really gone into today, but their approach to the mental health question was, and how are you feeling in of yourself? And I'm like, why can't we just say, how's your mental health doing? Why can't, there seems to be in certain aspects, there seems to be a kind of almost a frog in our throat that we know what we want to say, but we don't know how to get around that. Jean, what's your viewpoint in terms of measurement, both in terms of the answers and the questions? How good are we at being very open about some of those areas, and how do we improve it? Because we do, and the work that you've been talking about, you've seen a lot of different areas, and the work that you do for us as an institute, there's lots of different areas on this, but we need to be able to talk openly about all of them, don't we?
We do. I'm also a mental health first aider, and I know that this is one of the disabilities, if you like, mental ill health, that is often hidden. Over 50% of disabilities are hidden. There is no legal duty to disclose any disability, and there's a lot of reticence about that. People are afraid that if they do that, people will discriminate in promotion, how they view that candidate, and also, and it's very real fear actually, that this does happen. And again, that's down to general training and awareness at the right time, isn't it? Coming back to the point about how do we know we're improving, I work for an engineering company who are fantastic at recruiting in females and a diverse workforce from across the world. But what we've looked at, and we are studying this because we really want to maintain and have a very diverse workforce, is that quite often when a female leaves to have twins or one baby, they don't come back. They often don't come back. And then what is it about the workplace that makes it hard for them to do that? Is it the gap in the career progression, or is it more about the flexibility? Can we offer part-time? Can we offer family-friendly hours? And I mean, I think we're in a good place at the moment with COVID, where everybody is now re-looking at this and saying, oh, actually, do we all need to be in the office from between 9 and 5? Or could we work evenings and weekends and still get the work done? So there's a lot there, but I think we need to not count it once. We need to keep recounting. Yes, are they coming in? Are they applying? Are they getting the job? Are they staying? And are they getting promoted in the same way as other strands of intersectionality?
I think it's really interesting actually, because there is a tendency to look at kind of one-dimensional statistics, like what's the makeup of the workforce? Tick. But Colin's even mentioned we need to know attrition. Do they stay? Do they come in and leave again? And your point about mums. I mean, I can guarantee you, Mrs. Emma's counting down the days that she can get back to work. Six weeks.
I bet.
I don't think
Yeah,
she's going to have any.
I'm going to I'll second that one actually. It's a lot easier being in the office than being at home, I can tell you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm trying to do both at the moment, and I guess as well, this is another thing, right? Because we've got to be careful as well that we don't focus on the really obvious area of it, because I can sort of say that as a new dad, I do feel like the world's geared up for mums, and I'm sitting there going, no, I'm struggling here as well. This is tough for me as well, and I think there's lots of areas on that. Look, we're not going to believe it. We are 5 minutes away from finishing our discussion today, and like we find with all our webinars, we could go on and on and on and on. So I just want to thank our panel today for their insights, and I'm determined through the work that we do as an institute, through our research, through our support mechanisms, through our education programs, that this is a key area for us. And I know that the team who have tuned in today as well, that we'll be picking up some of the key themes. But to finish off today, can I just ask each of our panelists, if I gave you, and it's a horrible cliche question to do with a panel debate, but if I gave you a silver bullet, and I'm not saying there is one, but if you had one token to say that this is the one area of focus I think that we should start with, certainly not finish with, because it is nuanced. This is where I put my first lump of investment into this conversation. Where would it be? And Jean, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go through. There's a brief pause there. Everyone's like, who's he going to ask first? I could do with more time. But Jean, where would you put your investment if we were going to really move this debate forward?
Education, either formal, informal, a real mix. We have to get people thinking about it and exploring it and talking to people and learning from a whole, the complexity of society as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And being proactive with that education as well. I guess going back to our earlier point, it shouldn't end up being a kind of reform role for this education. You've slipped up, you better go on an education program.
Start with induction, not punishment.
Yeah, exactly that. Colin, I'm going to come to you next. Where would you put your investment in this debate? Bearing in mind that Jean's already put money into education, so we're covered on that front.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jean. You got the good one there. My answer was going to be awareness, but I think that the most important thing that can happen right now is for a significant amount of senior leaders in our society to actually proactively speak out about their support for these matters. I think that really needs to be seen.
So we're talking now these kind of like role models, allies, case studies, stories that make people realise this is an important debate, an important discussion.
Absolutely. Personally, I feel a sense of responsibility to people that have gone through what I've gone through or might be experiencing different challenges. I feel a responsibility to be open about my experience and my achievements in my life, so that if I suppose if I can just change the life of a few people, then great. I think that I have a responsibility to speak out about this kind of thing, and I think I'd like to see more senior leaders in our industry and in our society speaking out about this stuff.
Absolutely. And Laura, finish with yourself. We've got education's covered. We've got role models, case studies, stories, and leadership. Where would you put your investment in terms of supporting the D&I debate?
I would say recruitment and attracting the right people. So actually making the effort to go out using other mediums such as social media, things that haven't traditionally been used in the past, particularly in our industry, and using that as a way to attract people that wouldn't normally apply, for instance, for roles. So I think that investing in recruitment would definitely be one for me.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you for the panel, and apologies for throwing one of those curveball questions at you at the end, but it's always nice to keep you on your toes. We don't want everything to be too straightforward. But I'm sure everyone that's listening will see this is a wide-ranging debate. There's lots of work to do, and like I say, as an institute, we're determined to do as much of that as we can, and we'll be looking at our plans now to see how we can do that and how we can support the profession. So just a few things. To conclude, so clearly D&I is high on the agenda, rightly so, but we need to do more, and it can have great benefits to organisations, but more importantly, it can have great benefits to individuals and give people fulfilling, comfortable, safe, inclusive lives, and I think that is about balancing those two benefits side by side, because there really is no argument then to not put enough effort into this. And it's clear that workplace and facilities professionals can make a massive impact, whether that's through supporting their organisation's own D&I programs, through design of the workplace, the employee experience, which we didn't really get into, but it's another really interesting area. Or if it's about how we just encourage more diversity and inclusion in our own profession, in our own industry, and bringing up some of those diverse communities that we've already got here in our contracted service lines, that we can bring them up through the profession. And so we're in a good position actually, because some industries they haven't even got that far yet. So we've got a real opportunity. So I'm looking forward to this debate continuing. Just to give you a bit of signpost to some things, Jean's already mentioned one of the good practice guides that we've got on this. You can find more of those good practice guides, guidance notes and support materials in our Insight Hub. So if you go to the IWFM website, you'll be able to find things there. We've got more episodes of the webinar coming up. You can find details of those, as well as all of our support during the pandemic about the COVID-19 response, whether that's for the buildings, we're getting people back in the workforce. We've got some research in there that we've done, actually touching on some of the topics that Jean mentioned in terms of the flexibility agenda and getting that back in the workforce. And also we want to hear from you, whether it's on social media, whether it's via our policy team. You can email policy@iwfm.org.uk. We want to hear stories. We always want to hear stories, and in particular, as Colin said, let's get something about the D&I debate, and let's hear some real leadership moving forward on this debate. So final thing from me is to thank the team that no one sees behind the scenes that's making this webinar possible. I just get to talk into the camera, but there's a group of people making sure that all the wheels are turning. But more importantly, thank you to our panel, Colin, Jean and Laura, who have come here with great openness and honesty to talk about some of the great debates that are going on in D&I. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.